Well, good morning. Thanks for joining us. I'm Lauren Baker.
And I'm Tanner Holbrook. We begin with breaking news on this stream today as Kent County Prosecutor Chris Becker is set to announce if he intends to retry the case against former Grand Rapids Police Officer Christopher Schurr.
Christopher Schurr was charged with second-degree murder in the killing of Patrick Lyoya. Schurr pulled Lyoya over during a traffic stop in 2022, and the situation quickly developed into a struggle, with Schurr attempting to tase and arrest Lyoya multiple times, eventually ending up on top of Lyoya, shooting him in the back of the head and killing him.
So 2 weeks ago to the day, the multi-week trial of Christopher Schurr was ruled a mistrial, as the jury was unable to come to a unanimous verdict to either convict or acquit him. During the trial, Kent County Prosecutor Chris Becker gave the jury a different verdict option, where the jury could convict Schurr of a lesser crime of voluntary manslaughter rather than second-degree murder, but the jury remained hung.
And as we mentioned, today's announcement all stemmed from the jury's inability to reach a verdict in this controversial case.
So we want to take you back to that moment where, after days of jury deliberation, Judge Christina Mims declared that mistrial. Listen.
I wanted to verify that that's true, that you're unable to reach a verdict as a panel?
Correct.
Okay. And so what I'm going to do is declare a mistrial in this case.
And that day was the last time we heard from Prosecutor Chris Becker about this case. Becker addressed the media shortly after the hung jury verdict was reached and had this to say.
What happened today is not what anybody was expecting or wanted. We're hoping for a verdict, and I think the family, and I don't know if they've talked here, but they're extremely disappointed, as am I. This was something we were hoping to get a conclusion. We thought we'd put a good case forward. Obviously, the jury thought differently. They were hung. I spent quite a bit of time talking with them. They're very open, and they're really a good jury. I mean, they paid attention. They took a lot of notes. They obviously were in there for a long period of time and took this case seriously. So this is, this happens. This happens quite a bit in general cases, but especially if you look across the country, there's a number of police-involved incidents where it ends up in a hung jury quite a bit. So we always knew there was a possibility. It's a difficult case. This was not an easy case. This was not a simple case. So at this point in time, I'm sure the next question is, what am I going to do? And I'm not going to make a decision right now. This is something I'm going to take some of the jurors obviously wanted to talk more. They may be reaching out, so I'm going to talk to them and take a look at everything, and I'll make a decision somewhere down the road. I'm not making a decision today.
And of course, at the time of that press conference, he wasn't ready to make a decision. Today, it seems as if he is. And after Becker spoke, Schurr's defense attorney Matt Borgula addressed the media, but with a far different tone, believing this case shouldn't have even been brought.
I do not think this case should be retried. I don't think it should have been charged in the first place. I think that it was clear, based on the evidence, that there wasn't enough to establish a charge in this case. I think there was a lot of evidence at trial that was irrelevant and that shouldn't come in. And so if there is going to be another trial, we're going to likely seek rulings from appellate courts as to what evidence is put before the jury. In particular, I do not believe that this theory that was sponsored by Professor Stoughton, how an officer can put himself in jeopardy by following what he believes to be poor policies of GRPD, where he loses the right to defend himself should he later be put in a position where someone is about to use, he's an imminent threat of bodily harm or death. I think that's absolutely wrong. I think the jury was confused by the fact that the prosecutor was saying that he cannot defend himself because he screwed up on whether or not he should chase him. I think that had effect on the outcome and the fact that they couldn't reach a unanimous verdict. And so if there is going to be another trial, we're going to be asking the Court of Appeals to decide whether officer-created jeopardy is something that should apply in a criminal case, and whether officers, if they make any negligent act early on, they can no longer defend themselves if someone turns on them with a dangerous weapon.
And after the jury's verdict came back, the Lyoya family, along with attorney Ben Johnson, who's representing them in their civil suit against the police department, spoke to the media in a virtual conference about how they felt going through the trial and how it ended the way it did. Here's my report on that. After years of hopes and prayers,
to see that all these 3 years where we have been waiting for this case to be settled.
The family of Patrick Lyoya says a mistrial in the Christopher Schurr case has reopened past wounds.
I want to say that it hurts my family, my wife. We are bleeding. We are in pain.
Through an interpreter, the family spoke moments after the judge declared the mistrial in a press conference. Not only wanting justice, Lyoya's mom says her family was hoping Schurr would apologize for what happened when he took the stand.
I thought he would say, coming from his mouth, was going to say, I'm sorry to the family, to apologize for what he did wrong, but he didn't. And it seemed like the way that he portrayed himself, it was like he had no remorse. He had no guilt. He didn't care.
But with the potential of another trial, Lyoya's parents say this outcome won't stop them from fighting for justice for their son.
We are not going to be tired. I didn't give up on my son. And we are not going to be tired until when we find the justice for our son.
After their press conference, time went by without any movement in the case.
And in that time, the community began to gather on their own as they sought a way forward. 13 on your side's Kiara Patterson visited 2 community gatherings, one of which had Lyoya's father in attendance.
Our heart, like a family, we are broken.
3 years after Patrick Lyoya was shot and killed by former officer Christopher Schurr, his family says frustration and uncertainty remain. After Schurr's trial was declared a mistrial last week, 2 events Wednesday night gave the community space to process and plan a way forward.
We've received a number of questions, calls from constituents about the mistrial. But more importantly, this is a listening session.
The NAACP focused on education and gathering feedback, hosted at the Grand Rapids Center for Community Transformation. Education about future policy recommendations at both local and national levels.
We've been fighting on the federal level to pass the George Floyd Justice and Policing law for many years. We need answers in terms of, okay, what's the path forward and how do we get there?
Just blocks away, Kent County Commissioner Robert Womack hosted an event to support the Lyoya family.
I'm thankful to people from here to come to support us on this hard time. 3 years ago, Patrick was killed, but there's no justice for him until now.
They didn't make a wasted trip to America. They're going through a storm, but there are brighter days, and we're going to walk with them.
And while the family hopes for a retrial in the case, both events shared the same message. Organizers say healing starts with being heard.
And something important to remember with this potential outcome is that we could have 3 things that could happen. We could either have Becker say he wants to retry this case. He could ask if Schurr wants to plead guilty to some lesser charges, or he could dismiss this at all. Joining us now is Riley Mack. Riley, you were in the courtroom. throughout the whole entire trial, rather the courthouse. Kind of talk about leading up to this moment and then actually hearing the mistrial.
Absolutely. So the verdict came on May 8th, which is 2 weeks ago, and we've all kind of been waiting here for any sort of news that's going to come out of this. So on that day, on May 8th, the judge announced a mistrial, and I was in that courtroom to hear it happen. And you know, 2 days prior to that, it was on a Tuesday when the judge announced that there was a deadlock in the jury, and the jury just could not get past that deadlock at the time. And the judge made it clear, you know, get back to work. I want to see a verdict out of this. And she kind of, you know, said that to the jury that was in the room for that. I got to see that happen. When she announced that deadlock, there were some, you know, gasps in the room. There was gasp, and there was, you know, some people were sighing. There was some eye rolls. You know, people have waited years. It's been 3 years now since these charges came. They've been waiting to see a verdict in this. So she said, get back to work. And then 2 days later, when she said after 20 hours of jury deliberation that there would be no verdict, it was almost a quiet resignation in that courtroom. You know, a lot of the family members just looked down at the ground. Some were praying and stopped praying to, you know, quietly resign themselves to that this case was not over with yet after 3 years. Yeah, that was quite a moment. You could hear a pin drop in that moment.
All right, it sounds like Prosecutor Chris Becker is early. We are waiting to get the go-ahead to go to that press conference live as we are getting ready to hear that decision on the Schurr retrial here very, very shortly. Again, we're going to go to that live now, and we'll take that live as we get it.
Breaking news now on 13 on your side.
I'm Lauren Baker.
And I'm Tanner Holbrook. We are beginning with breaking news today. Kent County Prosecutor Chris Becker is set to announce if he intends to retry the case against former GRPD Officer Christopher Schurr in the Patrick Lyoya case. Let's go ahead and watch
Into this,
now.
we were thinking about, you know, getting a good jury. I even went over and watched more of the trial. I reviewed the trial because sometimes, you know, you're in the moment, you miss things. So I would try to review the trial. So I took everything into account when I made this decision, and basically what it boils down to is I don't think we reach a different verdict if I do a retrial in this case. The jury came back deadlocked. Two main reasons, I think. One of the biggest reasons is, you know, I looked at my case specifically, and I don't think it comes in any differently. You know, a lot of times in a retrial, you have things that didn't come in cleanly. You have things that may have not been, you know, gone the way you hoped. This came in as clean as I could have expected. I thought we presented a good case. I presented everything I wanted. All the facts were out there that I had, and it's not like I can change anything. There's no different things that I'm going to be able to change in presenting this case a second time. Something that I missed, something along those lines, and that very often goes into these decisions that, well, we could have done this differently. You know, no case is absolutely perfect, but there are, you know, minor things that may have happened, but there's nothing earth-shattering that's going to change how I present this case or what the facts are that come into the case. The second thing is, and like I said before, I think the jury selection is the biggest thing. I think I said before, and I'll say it again, I think we had a really good jury. These were very conscientious jurors. They were put in a unique situation. We've never had a situation where we've spent, you know, a week, almost 5 days, picking a jury where they're sitting alone, you know, for days on end before they even start hearing the case. With that being said, they paid attention. They asked good questions. They were engaged that entire time. So this was a really good jury from my perspective, and I can't always say that. You know, the questions they asked were, for the most part, on point when they're going through that process, and they spent a long time in deliberations. So they took this case, gave it the seriousness that it should have gotten. Now, I know some of the numbers have been out there. From my understanding, this did play a role in my decision making. You know, it initially came out as 4-4-4, kind of a split. Or kind of undecided. It did shift to 7-5, I think right about the time we got the first maybe we're hung kind of a response from the jury, and then it moved 10-2 for not guilty. So that does play a role, and so with that being, I took a look at what is our history in our office in terms of trial, and quite frankly, we've had about 15 hung juries in the last 6 years, and we've only retried one in that 6-year period, and that was 11-1 for guilty. And looking at the facts of that case, it was a pretty overwhelming case, and so that's a case where you have a rogue juror. This was not a case with a rogue juror. I think this case, they paid attention, they did a lot to try and arrive at a verdict, and they couldn't arrive at a verdict. So then it goes back to, okay, what do I do differently? What can we do differently the next time we have this jury panel or to select a jury? I looked at what we did in the process. There were 43 strikes for cause. A lot of those were, they couldn't spend the time, they had conflicts, whatever it may be. But out of those, I recognize there were 15 that we said showed a bias to our case, at least in the process right there when we're questioning them. That didn't even reach, we had identified 30 before we even started selecting a jury of what I would term problematic jurors that I could say, geez, they're going to be a problem if we get them on the panel. They didn't make it into the jury box. So we then used 10 of our 12 peremptory challenges. I talked about this earlier where we cleaned out people that after they came forward and for whatever reason, for a variety of reasons, some of which had ties with law enforcement, that we did everything we could. I can't eliminate everybody that has ties to law enforcement, because I've heard that out there is that, well, there's people on there that had ties to law enforcement. You're not going to eliminate everybody. That's not possible. So that's always going to be a factor. So what it boils down to is, I put the best case I could forward. When I tried this case, I did the best I could. I did everything I could. The jury couldn't reach a verdict. I still stand by the decision. I have, been involved in a number of officer-involved shooting cases or use of force cases. I've cleared most of them. This is one I thought should go to a jury. Have a jury decide based on, there's a substantial question of the reasonableness of his actions based on the totality of circumstances. We argued that, and the jury, a very good jury, was not able to reach a verdict. So I just don't see how, when you do your best you can, it comes in as good as you can. Generally, it's going to go worse the second time around, and I just don't see us being able to reach a verdict. I think you'll have the same, even if maybe we get some people on our on our side more in terms of, I think we'll just have the same amount maybe hung on the other side. I just don't see a place where we get 12 people to agree. This has split the community. I've heard over the last 2 weeks people passionately on both sides calling me, emailing me, advocating for and against a retrial. So that didn't play a role. I got to make this decision on my own. And looking at everything I had, looking at the facts, quite frankly, I felt there was not a basis to be able to retry this case and have a verdict at the end. So I made the decision to not do that.
Can you talk about the message this sends to the community?
Yeah, I don't know if there's any message. I'm not big on messages sending to the community. I mean, I think we try and make our decisions based on the facts and analysis, and in every case. I mean, I don't think this is, something that I'm trying to send a message by, charging him or not charging him. I made this decision based on the facts, based on the law, and what I thought I could prove. Like I said, I thought it went as good as it could have, but the jury, it's always a jury decision, and you never know what the jury's going to do. But based on what I had, we had a very good jury, and I just don't see it, coming to a different conclusion. So I don't know if there's a message there. It's, I think to some extent the system works. I think this is a split community on this issue, and but I still trust in the jury system, and sometimes this happens.
What does this mean for Schurr? Is he a free man now? What does this mean for him?
There's, we're not proceeding any further. He's been free. He's been out on bond all this time, so he's gonna, we're just not gonna proceed. The case will essentially, be closed.
Did you consider reducing the charge and going for a conviction for voluntary manslaughter?
No, I thought about that, but I think that's kind of, that looks like, I wasn't confident in my second-degree. I think it was a second-degree murder, and if the jury wanted to consider a lesser, I just didn't think that was, we were accused during the trial of trying to switch around what we're doing, and if that's what I thought it was at the start, I'm not going to change it just to maybe, okay, let's try a different way to get a guilty verdict. At the beginning, I thought it was a second-degree murder, and I'm going to try it on that or not try it at all.
Can you talk about, have you spoken to them?
And again, you are watching breaking news as Kent County Prosecutor Chris Becker has announced he is not going to retry the case of Christopher Schurr.
Yeah, so we are going to continue our live coverage on our streaming app. 13 Plus is free to download on your television, and we will return you to regular programming right now. Again, more coverage continuing right now on 13 Plus. Thanks for joining us.
This has been a breaking news report from 13 on your side.
Well, if you're joining us, we're continuing our coverage of the announcement from Chris Becker on his decision on the Christopher Schurr trial.
Yeah, and that decision is that he will not retry Christopher Schurr in the shooting death of Patrick Lyoya. Again, it was a second-degree murder charge that the jury did end up being hung on here. And of course, that mistrial was declared. Again, that decision to not retry that charge. Let's listen back into some of the questioning as Chris Becker is right there at the podium with reporters asking questions.
Process. So, I knew the gravity of this decision. It has a big impact on the community, it has a big impact on, the Schurr family, it has a big impact on the Lyoya family. So I didn't want to rush into it after, trials take a chunk out of you. It was a very, I spent a lot of time on this case. My office spent a lot of time on this case. Michigan State Police, they did a very nice job. They spent a lot of time on this case. So it's not like I'm just going to come up with a decision that at that moment I wanted to be thoughtful and consider everything I could, and that's why I took the time I did.
The jury foreperson, when they came in to announce they were hung, looked angry. Did you get a chance to talk with them?
Yeah, I think I told you, we asked about that last time. She said she kind of slipped in the chair, and she wasn't angry, mad. She kind of fell into the chair. So that's the response I got at the time. So that's all I can tell you. That's she kind of addressed that. She didn't appear to be that way.
Did what the holdouts were holding out for?
I don't know. We didn't, it's not, and that's the thing. It's it's not like we talked to every single juror. There was only certain jurors that wanted to talk to us, so and we didn't. It's not like we tried to press them. I mean, so I wasn't involved in the deliberations to know, blow by blow. So I don't, didn't get that in depth.
So if Christopher Schurr wanted his job back at the GRPD, they said he didn't violate training or policy.
That's up. You'd have to ask GRPD that. I don't know how they'd handle that. But obviously there's no criminal conviction, so yeah, and we're not seeking anything further.
Can you estimate on the cost of the trial between expert witnesses and security? And
oh geez, no, cost did not play a role whatsoever. I mean, that's we spent a lot on experts in terms of what the sheriff spent on security. I don't know that that's outside of my budget. I know a part of our budget we budgeted in for experts because we spent a substantial amount. I still haven't got the full. I think we're missing at least one of them, but we're probably $60,000, $70,000 just in experts.
The defense had mentioned that had this gone to another trial, they would have appealed or filed for the exclusion of certain evidence, particularly looking at the police training. Did that play a decision at all, or did that play a role?
No, I mean it's been like this for the last 3 years. I mean we fought this all the way up to the Supreme Court essentially, and so just the fact that they said, oh, we're going to fight some more, yeah, that you don't look at costs, you don't look at what that is. It's can you bring it to a conclusion you think there's a reasonable chance, and I just don't think there is.
If the jury had been split 50-50, would we have a different decision today?
I don't know. I mean, that's the thing. You don't know that because it's not just looking at those numbers. It's looking at they spent a lot of time, and that part of it. And when you look at if they come back in an hour and they say we're hung, and well, did they really spend a lot of time? So there's so many different factors. That's just one factor I definitely took a look at. But it's not just okay. The jury came back. It's 11-1. We're going to automatically retry. You take a look at everything. So I can't just say that's a hypothetical, but I don't know.
Can you talk about what they were hung up on? I don't know if you've mentioned that.
I don't, what they're hung out. They talked what they were talking about. They're on the issues. I mean, they're on the issues, and training came up, and reasonableness of use of force. I mean, they were on point in terms of the things we argued. What hung them up, and what they really got them. And once again, I'm only speaking for the ones that spoke to me. You could get a different perspective depending on a different juror. But they were, from what I got I spoke to more than one. They were definitely on the issues, the points. And they weren't off on some tangents. I've talked to juries where you're like, how did you come up with that? This was not that jury, so they were definitely on the things both sides were focusing on.
Did you get a sense from jurors, or do you imagine that there's a difference between jurors who reside in Grand Rapids versus the rest of the county?
Don't know. Yeah, I didn't get into that. I really don't know who, yeah, we have it when we go through the jury, but when we were talking with them, I don't know.
Can you talk about the racial issue here? Obviously, this became a racial issue. There were civil rights leaders here.
Sure.
Marches and protests, and now this decision. Can you discuss that?
What would you like to discuss? It's been an issue, in terms of the relations between the police and the minority community. That is an issue. I don't know what else we can say about that. That I think there's a lot of split along those lines when you look in the community and how people side on that. But that's, quite frankly, it's nothing new. That's always been out there for probably as long as I've been, a prosecutor. So it's, I'd like to see it healed. I'd like to see that come together. I hope at some point in time we can. But I don't know if this, even if we get a conviction or not guilty, I don't think that changes the underlying issues. I don't think that somehow cures everything if we suddenly won this trial or flip, there's an acquittal. It's going to be out there, and it's something we're all going to deal with, and I think we're all trying, we being law enforcement, are trying to deal with that. I think Chief Winstrom's trying to deal with that. He's been trying to deal with that since this happened, and it's something I try and deal with as well in terms of my outreach. So it's something we always got to work on, and I hope we continue to do so.
Do you think they need more policy changes at GRPD, specifically the foot chase policy?
That's going to be up to GRPD. I have a number of policies. I don't, ask the chief on my policies, and, that's something that's going to that's up to GRPD.
Do you have any input on their policies?
No. Nope, never have, and they don't have any input in my policies either. So, one more question?
Chris, legally, does this preclude, is this the end of the case, or can the state attorney general file charges on this, or even, of course, federal charges could still come?
Technically, the attorney general could. She never has before, but technically, I think that there's always a possibility. But
have you heard from her office?
No, nope, not at all. All right, thank you.
Again, if you're just joining us, we're hearing from Prosecutor Chris Becker on his decision to not retry the case of Christopher Schurr. We heard a lot of his decision. Also, something interesting is actually hearing what he spoke to the jurors about this case.
Yeah, very interesting indeed. He gave a couple of interesting stats, something we were wondering about, the jury makeup and which way they voted each time. It sounds like there was anywhere between 1 to 3 votes, obviously, that they took. At the first one, 4 and 4 is how the jury was split. And then you got to 7-5 in that jury split, and then 10-2 for a not guilty verdict is what he said in his words there. So very interesting on where that jury landed. He said that jury stuck with the issues. He said sometimes juries in these situations can get off on tangents, and what he meant by that was, are they sticking to the facts of the case, or are they kind of going off on their own headcanons in some cases? But this time he said that the jury really did stick with the facts, and he thought it was a very good jury, especially given the days that they were given to talk with the jurors there. But very interesting because he says it was a good jury. He doesn't think that they could have tried the case any differently at this point, and all of that concluding into his conclusion to not retry the case today.
Yeah, absolutely. And kind of the question that remains is what comes next.
Yeah.
And he spoke on it that it could possibly, the Attorney General could say, I want to press charges. That could be the next step. But we know that, Christopher Schurr has another case coming up. It's a civil case. The Lyoya family is suing Christopher Schurr in a civil case. And it's interesting because after the mistrial announcement, Matt Borgula, the defense attorney, said that a lot of the evidence did not fit this case. And our experts actually spoke on that, saying some of the evidence, particularly the officer created jeopardy, where the argument that Christopher Schurr put himself into harm's way would be better fit for a civil case rather than a criminal case. So that civil case is coming up, and Lyoya family, they spoke on that and said, they are very hopeful that they're going to get a good outcome out of this case. And it is a lot more likely in a civil case versus a criminal case. Kind of the difference is that, a civil case is a private, family suing a person rather than, the government being involved in that decision. And typically in a criminal case, you have to prove your case beyond a reasonable doubt. But in a civil case, it's a much more lax kind of parameter, I guess. Mm-hmm. You can do more of, it's more, you need to prove that the evidence is likely true. So it is more likely that the Lyoya family will get, the justice that they're looking for, the kind of verdict that they're looking for out of this civil case that's coming up.
And this whole time, we've been talking with experts about this case. We're going to bring those in. Those are, again, is Andrew Rodenhouse and Tanya Phelan-Krause. Tanya, I want to start with you on your reaction to hearing that Becker will not be retrying this case. Were you expecting this? We're going to go to Andrew first. Andrew, can you tell us, what was your reaction?
My reaction is I think that this is probably the correct decision. In listening to Mr. Becker discuss with the press about what went into his decision, it's well thought out. I think he took into account all the different factors that play into this decision. He heard from community people. He heard from on both sides. He said that didn't really weigh into his decision as much as I think probably what weighted into it the most is that you could try this case 100 times, and 100 times you could have a hung jury every time. And that at some point in time, it's not fair to the Schurr Mr. Schurr to have to go through that. And you know, it really is one of these things where it is what it is, and it's a tragedy all around. I don't think anyone would say it's not. And I think that at the end of the day, when you look at the amount of community resources that were poured into this, the amount of law enforcement engagement to keep the courthouse, keep people safe going to and from the courthouse, and you look at all those things, I think that he made the correct decision. Not that he needs my affirmation. I know Mr. Becker certainly doesn't need my affirmation, but I do think from my perspective, he made the correct decision.
Tanya, what about you?
Yeah, good afternoon. You know, as we have said all throughout this case, Mr. Becker is a very talented, seasoned trial lawyer. And we anticipated, both Andrew and I anticipated, that he was going to take his time, reflect on how that case was presented, talk to the Lyoya family, and make a decision on whether he should go forward or not. And given the severity of the original charges, and given the effort and time that he put into the original prosecution, I don't think we can take lightly that he made a decision to not go forward. He would not make that decision lightly, and he wouldn't make that decision unless he thought, as Andrew just said, that we could keep ending up with this same result of a hung jury over and over again. And if that were to happen, then we reach a point where it would be honestly a miscarriage of justice to continue putting the person on trial over and over again with the same result. So at the end of the day, although this case still remains a tragedy, someone is dead, and families and friends' lives have been altered forever on both sides. But at the end of the day, I think Mr. Becker made the right decision. And now this will continue to be litigated in the civil arena with a whole different standard, and where some of the evidence that came in the original trial is more aptly presented in that civil case.
And Tanya, we do know that that civil trial could be happening in the next year or two, but I want to ask about a question that was asked to Becker in regards to the Attorney General actually taking on this case. Is that a real possibility, or is that something that's kind of far-fetched at this point?
I don't know that it's far-fetched. I mean, it's possible that the Attorney General could take a look at it and make a decision on whether they wanted to prosecute or not. But before the Attorney General made such a decision, I think they would do exactly what Mr. Becker just did over the last 2 weeks. They would review what happened at the first trial, how the case came in, and assess whether they thought they could achieve a different outcome.
In terms of the civil case, you brought that up, Tanya. Can you talk to what we're going to see going forward in that case based off of the decision that was made today and everything that we have heard over the last several weeks in the trial?
Well, you know, immediately after the hung jury was declared, the civil team for the Lyoya family held a press conference, and they pretty much laid out what they thought was going to happen going forward. But the case will proceed. It will proceed along the lines of a civil case where there are depositions and interrogatories and preparing for trial. And I do expect that if that case goes to trial as a civil case, that we are going to hear a lot about the officer created jeopardy and issues like that that are more relevant to the issue of negligence than is in a criminal case.
Hey, Andrew, we want to ask you about the jurors. We heard Becker talk almost positively about them, saying that they really focused on the facts of the case, showing the process of going from 4-4 to 7-5 to the 10-2. Can you guys just talk about the jury and how it worked for them, I guess, essentially, in this case?
Well, I can try to speculate to what the jury's thought process was. Typically, in my experience with jury, the first thing they're directed to do is to select a foreperson, and the foreperson then is charged with making sure that they deliberate in what's called a business-like manner. And so probably what happened is that the foreperson usually will call a vote like immediately to see like where's everybody at. Just say, hey, what are your initial out of the gate? What's your initial vote? And so it sounded like that initial vote was the 4-4 vote. And then Mr. Becker had said that when they first came back and said that they were deadlocked, it sounded like they were 7-5. And then after the additional couple of days of deliberation, and it's really helpful, I think, for the jurors to have the jury instructions with them so they can review the facts, read the jury instructions. And it sounds like that they came back. Mr. Becker said 10-2. I had heard that they were actually hung 10-2 on the lesser included and 11-1 on the murder in the second degree. In any event, it was a hung jury. And, you know, jurors are instructed to stay with your convictions. And so there was jurors, they held to their convictions, and that was how it's supposed to work. And in our system of government, the reason that we require unanimous juries is because the government is such an overwhelming creature when it comes to prosecuting. And I'm quoting my good professor, Tanya Cross-Phelan, and that as a defense attorney, you are the shield that is stopping the full weight and force of the government from bearing down on you. And that's what the jurors are there for, as their fellow citizens, to protect you. And that's why it requires unanimous verdict. In the civil case, it won't require a unanimous verdict. And interestingly, just last week, the United States Supreme Court issued an opinion regarding Officer. It was another type of civil case where an officer was involved in bad behavior against the defendant, and they didn't reach a conclusion on whether or not there was a officer created jeopardy. I think that Mr. Johnson, Ben Johnson, had said that it's pretty well established in the Sixth Circuit. I have no reason to doubt him that it is established in the Sixth Circuit, but the United States Supreme Court at least expanded somewhat the ability to bring civil suit against officers when they have misconduct or use excessive force.
Well, Tanya and Andrew, thank you so much for jumping in and speaking with us again. We appreciate you coming in.
Well, thank you for having us.
We're going to be wrapping up this coverage now. I do want to let people know we are starting to get reaction. We're hearing from Ben Johnson and the Lyoya family. They've sent out a statement. I'm not going to read the whole thing because we have to wrap up, but they do say the Lyoya family has not only lost Patrick, but now the hope that former Officer Christopher Schurr will ever be held criminally accountable for taking Patrick's life. So we're going to be hearing hopefully more from the Lyoya family later today, but obviously reactions starting to come in.
Absolutely. Of course, we're going to leave our coverage there, and coming up in just under 10 minutes at noon, we'll be back on the air on WZZM with Deja Barrett and 13 on Your Side at noon. Thanks for joining us.